Welcome all for this evening gathering, at least here in Chicago. I know people are coming in from around the world, where we are going to explore the early history of the Holy Land with Stephen Hall, who is a beloved instructor here at the University of Chicago Graham School. On an evening like this one, I'm especially proud and honored to say that I am the Dean of the University of Chicago Graham School, and we welcome you enthusiastically, virtually, to our campus here on what is another gorgeous night here this summer. For those of you who are not familiar with the Graham School, you should be. We are now 132 years young. We have been trailblazing paths since 1890 to bring the big ideas of this university to learners around the world. And what that looks like today is 4 programs. We have a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world. We have a basic program of liberal education for adults that Stephen Hall teaches in, where you can go deep into the great books with a Socratic approach over 4 years. We have open enrollment, where the courses that you will hear about tonight are found, where you can explore across all of the different disciplines of this university. And then we have annual programs where you can go deep into everything from knowing Chicago to understanding the future of museum publishing. But the reason that you are all here tonight is not to hear about the Graham School. It is to hear from one of the eminent minds here at the University of Chicago, Stephen Hall. Let me start just by introducing him, and then we'll jump into conversation. Stephen Hall has been teaching in the basic program since 1992. Which for those of you who are mathematically inclined means we are 3 decades into his phenomenal leadership here at the Graham School. He is also someone who came to the University of Chicago for his education, where he is ABD for the PhD in Hebrew Bible at the Divinity School of the university. He also has earned a master's in Hebrew Language Studies at the American Institute in Jerusalem, and a THM in Old Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. So he is someone that knows a lot about the topics that we are about to jump into. And he has a sequence coming up this year, which we are very excited about, looking at the history of the Holy Land. And in tonight's conversation, we're going to cover the first course in that 3-course sequence, which looks at prehistory to the Roman Empire. And so to set the table, Stephen, for the rest of our conversation, I wanted to start with a definitional question to ask you, what is the Holy Land that you're going to be exploring the history of? And how did you come to that geographic definition of the Holy Land for this course?
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you, Seth, for that introduction. And hello, everybody. I can see some of your faces, and I recognize a few of you. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest. So the Holy Land has its start with the idea of the Promised Land that probably starts with the story of Abraham, where God speaks to Abraham. We can read about that story in the book of Genesis, where God tells Abraham to leave your land, to go to the land that I will show you, and there I will make you into a great nation, and by you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So it's part of that story of Abraham, where God calls Abraham out from southern Mesopotamia to come to a particular land that God will show him. We surmise from that this is the Promised Land. The first time that we know of where they use the word Holy Land is in the prophet Zechariah, one of the much later prophets, separated from Abraham, at least in terms of story, by perhaps 1,000 years. And Zechariah refers to the land, Haaretz. It's Haaretz HaKodesh, right? That is the Holy Land. And so then from then on, it becomes known as this Holy Land. But its parameters are established in the rest of the story in Genesis a little bit, but then more specifically later on in Deuteronomy and in the book of Joshua. And so what it becomes, the Holy Land becomes limited to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and the land between, roughly speaking, the Mesopotamia, the region of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, especially the Euphrates, the northwestern region of the Euphrates, and the Nile River. Some of this is actually, quite debatable. Whether we have a maximal view of the Holy Land or we have a minimal view of the Holy Land. But then once this land is, shall we say, circumscribed and stories occur on the land is distributed, there is a kingdom that develops, the kingdom of Israel, which has boundaries that grow and shrink in time. Once that's established, it then becomes primary for the people of ancient Israel. I want to show you a map. Let me see if I can get to this map here. It's in my mailbox. I thought I had it up. Yeah, okay. Oh, you know what I need to do? I think I need to share my screen. Will I be able to share a screen, Seth?
You have absolute right to share your screen.
Okay, very good. So here I need to go back. Oh boy, I hope I can do this. Full screen. I'll go full screen here. Oh, good. Now I can share my screen. I'm going to share my screen. And
We see it.
Good. So you see it? All right.
Although we see your email. There we go. Now we see your screen. Perfect.
All right. So now I need to move. This down here. Okay. Very good. So now you're looking at a map of what scholars eventually are going to recognize as the ancient Near East. Right? Notice that term Near East, it's kind of a European term. That is, it's not the Far East, but it's the Near East. So let me show you a couple of markers here. You can see the Caspian Sea. You can see the Persian Gulf where my cursor is. Here is the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And here we have the region of Mesopotamia. See the green area here? This is the region of Mesopotamia. And the Nile River, the promised land, is going to be that land between, oh, look, here it is, the Jordan River down to the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, as it's referred to, and the Mediterranean. At its widest point, it's 70 miles wide. At its longest point, let's say from the Gulf of Aqaba all the way up to the northernmost point, it's about 220 miles wide. In terms of square footage, it's no bigger than the state of New Jersey. So we're talking about this land strip, and look what it does. It connects Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Egypt, or we could say Asia, maybe even as far over as Europe and Egypt. All right, so that's where the story originates. It originates in the, or shall I say, that's where the idea of the Holy Land originates. It originates in the story of Abraham and the promise in that story that the character God makes to the character Abraham and his offspring. Seth, I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to take down that screen for a second here so that we can see you again. Right. If you don't mind taking down your screen, Stephen.
Yes,
and then I want
to
jump into the role of Jerusalem because, there's the Holy Land. And then over time, the anchor of it in some ways becomes Jerusalem. It's obviously still contested. But tell us how Jerusalem becomes the focal point, so to speak, or the anchor within this region, the size of New Jersey.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, Jerusalem is going to be the focal point. Jerusalem is going to be the center. I can tell you this, when I lived in Jerusalem, one of the exercises that I had to do for my Hebrew language class was to go out on the street and talk to people. And I talked to one person, and I was speaking Hebrew, and he was nice enough to speak Hebrew back to me. It was very nice. I found out that he wasn't from Jerusalem, but he was from Tel Aviv. And he says to me, Jerusalem. When you come to Jerusalem, you don't need to take drugs. That was the idea. Jerusalem is this place that has this aura about it, because I can tell you this, the world meets in Jerusalem. The world comes to Jerusalem. Whether you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, or someone related to one of those, you're gonna try to get to Jerusalem someday in your life. But anyway, how does it have its start? We could say that it has its start with Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac, but I'm going to fast forward, jump ahead. It really gets going when David becomes king and establishes his political headquarters in Jerusalem. For David, this is a very strategic move, because Saul, the first king in Israel, but not the first king of all of Israel, Saul, the first king in Israel, is from the northern tribes. Some of you may know that there's some tension between the northern tribes of Israel and the dominant southern tribes of Israel. David is from Judah, the southern tribes, from Bethlehem. His headquarters was in the region of Hebron, which is south of Bethlehem. He makes this strategic move. He moves north to a Canaanite city called Jebus. He conquers its fortress. That fortress, the Hebrew word for fortress is Zion. Now, some of you might be able to hear in the word Zion, you can hear now the anglicized version of it, Zion, right? So what happens, David conquers this fortress of Jebus. Solomon, his son, builds the temple. And then what happens is this place of Jerusalem, this place of Jebus, becomes the theocratic center for all of Israel. So much so that the book of Deuteronomy says that all Israel should come to Jerusalem 3 times a year for worship. Of course, there's a lot going on there theologically, but nevertheless, Jerusalem, through the Davidic dynasty, becomes the center of ancient Israel. And it remains so, and it remains, shall we say, the hope of Judaism to return to Jerusalem. As we press forward into the Babylonian captivity and the people are exiled, that we'll get into that a little bit. So Jerusalem has its origins with the Davidic dynasty. You can read about that in a chapter in the Bible. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 7. I'll leave that. You can look at that at another time.
Well, so we've set the table, I think. We understand the geography of the Holy Land. We understand the centrality of Israel. I now want to dive into this time period that your first course focuses on, Stephen. So, you talk about this being prehistory to the Roman Empire. So can you talk to us about what is happening in this land in prehistory, and how do we even know it? Since as I understand prehistory, and you can share more as a historian and a biblical scholar, this is a time period where we don't have formal written records. So, tell us what we understand about that period. And what we're going to do, just for everyone's knowledge, is we're going to kind of follow the land over this period. Lots of empires and people change, but the land remains the same. And so we're kind of going to look across this period, what's happening on this Holy Land. So prehistory, what's happening?
Yeah, Seth, very good. I think your last comment is really important. That is, in this course, as we cover at least 2,000 years of history in this first quarter, what remains constant is the land. It's actually more than 2,000 years. We do start with prehistory. And what we have in the land, in this land, in the city of Jericho, is one of the more significant Neolithic centers in prehistory. So this is at least 7,000 years ago, right? At least 5,000 BC. there is a city in Jericho with a 9-foot thick wall, defense wall, and over a 30-foot tower in it. So obviously, even though it's called prehistory, it is certainly not pre-civilization. And so what you have in Jericho is you have fresh water, you have springs, you have plains, you have good soil. So you can, and so now if you build a fortified city, now you've got a place to live. The question is, who are you defending that city against? So then what we would have to do is we'd have to expand out and say, so what's the Neolithic world in the ancient Near East? And so that's part of what we'll do. That's where we'll begin in this course. Yeah.
Well, and so we're going to now kind of go through different moments as we move toward the Roman Empire. And in many ways, and we talked in advance, we can kind of understand these moments based on people and kind of rulers. And so, we can start in many ways after prehistory with the land in the time of Abraham. And so, I'm curious kind of for you to give us a snapshot of what's happening now. This is, significantly later than that prehistory time period.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So let me just make something clear here. Many of us read the Bible from different perspectives. Some of us read the Bible as history. Some of us read it as revelation. Some of us read it as cultural document. For the sake of our conversation, I'm going to assume that the stories in the Bible are valid. And at least in terms of the land, I'm going to assume that they're valid because I've read the stories. I've traveled the land by various modes, on foot, on bicycle, on car, on bus. So I've traveled the land quite a bit, and the storytellers of the Bible make sense regarding the land of the Bible. Okay, so I'm going to assume that the story is valid. So when we start with Abraham, what we see is Abraham is not traveling on the main roads. He's traveling up in the hills. We've looked at the map that I looked at where this land, this promised land, this holy land is between Mesopotamia and the Nile. Even in that region, the coastal plain is much more significant. You might say that the coastal plain is Interstate 80 that goes across the country of the United States, east and west, or I should pick a north-south route. Interstate 75, or you can think of one that's on the east coast or someone that's on the west coast, whatever. That is the main route. There is another main route in the Transjordan that goes from Damascus down to the Gulf of Aqaba. Actually, in ancient sources, those two routes are named. One of them is called the Via Maris, that is the way of the sea, and you follow the coastal plain because that's the path of least resistance. The other is what's called the King's Highway, and apparently it was the royal route from Damascus in the north down to the Gulf of Aqaba in the south. But Abraham and his family, they're avoiding that region. They're staying in the hill country. And the hill country is defined by ridge routes. Ridge routes, if any of you have done any hiking, you know that you want to hike along a ridge because a ridge doesn't make you go up and down deep ravines. So there is a main north-south ridge route in the land of Israel, land of ancient Israel. And then there are east-west connectors to this north-south ridge route in the hill country that will connect it to the Via Maris or to the King's Highway. And that's essential for the land. The more you understand those ridge routes, the better you're going to understand the stories that you read in the Bible.
And so this, I believe, Stephen, though you're the expert, is around, 2,000 years before Christ, if I'm remembering correctly.
And that's since the land stays the same.
Yeah.
It's going to be the same for Abraham, for David, for the Syrians, the Babylonians, for the Maccabees and for the Romans. It's going to be the same as we run through the history.
Melissa Wilson has a question. What year does Abraham appear? Just so we date that and then we come forward into.
Yeah, so here's the way we could talk about this. We could say that, more or less, we could say Moses is around 1500. I mean, if we wanted to, this is quite, I would say, quite conservative. We could say Abraham is 2000, Moses is 1500, and David is 1000.
Right.
That's not a bad way of looking at it. A historian is going to argue about that, and I would even argue about that. But it's not a bad start. You think of Abraham as 2000, Moses is 500, Moses is 1500, David is 1000. The Babylonian captivity around 600, Alexander the Great around 300, and the Romans come in, in 63 BCE. So that kind of runs you through the chronology there. Yeah.
And so tell us about the land over a couple more of these periods, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. I already see a great one here from Ginny. Let's come into, during David and Isaiah, which I know are two separate times, but just if we can kind of cover what's happening to the land during that period, and then we'll come into, kind of beyond that prophetic time period.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So there is actually only a very small time period in ancient Israel where the land is unified under a single monarch. It's the time of David and Solomon, and then David's grandson, Rehoboam, and only for a short time. Less than 100 years is the land ever fully unified in one kingdom. And what happens is by the time of David's grandson, the kingdom splits. The tribes of Israel split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And what we're going to see is that these two kingdoms are not as strong divided as they would be united. And therefore, they can't resist when empires grow and want to expand. So what happens when you talk about the empires of Mesopotamia, when they're looking to expand, you got to think about the geography of Mesopotamia. The empires of Mesopotamia, they're blocked on the east by what's called the Zagros Mountains. They don't go east. But what they do is they head west. They head west to Anatolia, and they head south down to Egypt. Oh, but what happens when they head south? They're going to run into Israel. They're going to run into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So in around 725, the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians and taken over. But the southern kingdom of Judah hangs on because of some of the special geography that's around Judah, and Jerusalem survives as well because Jerusalem is part of the Judean kingdom. Jerusalem hangs on for another 125 years until the Babylonians from southern Mesopotamia, they finally get strong enough and they say, oh, I want to expand. They head towards Anatolia. From Anatolia, they head south towards Egypt. As they head south towards Egypt, oh my gosh, who's in the way but Judah and Jerusalem, right? This promised land, I'm not sure it's the best thing. I mean, if I were Abraham, I would say, hey, God, maybe Yemen would be a little better place. You got us stuck between a rock and a hard place here. The same thing with Egypt. When Egypt wants to expand, they can go south as far as Nubia if they want to. They can't go east and west because it's all desert. Where do they go? They go north. They go north through the land of Canaan. They go north through the land of Israel. They get up to Mesopotamia, and they're going to expand to Mesopotamia or over to Anatolia. So the geopolitics of the region is played out between the superpowers. When those superpowers are weak, Israel ascends. That's the time of David and Solomon. But then when those superpowers arise again, the northern kingdom falls in 725. The southern kingdom, along with Jerusalem, falls in 586. Jerusalem is destroyed. The diaspora is created. And the hope of return arises in prophetic literature. And so you would hear somebody like Isaiah say, as many of us remember from Handel's Messiah. Nachmu, Nachmu, Ami, Yomar Adon Elohecha. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and call unto her, for she has paid double for all her sins. It's the hope of return. And the portion of Isaiah, which people refer to as Deutero-Isaiah, speaks in the most elegant and lofty terms about return to the land and reestablishing their homes, their families, and the kingdom of ancient Israel. Right? Seth, I think that takes us into Isaiah, the Babylonian captivity. Where else shall we go?
Yeah, I mean, I want to make sure we get to the questions. So let's go there. And can you take us maybe all the way through Alexander the Great, which I know is no small thing because we have to get to Cyrus. And then we'll have our final question, you and I, on Pompeii, because that finishes this time period. And then we'll get to the questions that are populating the chat.
Yeah, very good. So with the Babylonian captivity, the Persian Empire, some of you may remember reading about them in Herodotus. The Persian Empire finally crosses the Zagros Mountains and they're heading west, right? They've established the Afghan plain that we know of today, all the way to the Indus River. Now they're heading west. They cross the Zagros Mountains in mass. Cyrus, their great leader, this Medo-Persian leader, is, shall we say, acknowledged in Herodotus. He's acknowledged for some of the great things that he did, but he's also, shall we say, downgraded for overreaching, for going too far. Oh, but in Isaiah, in Deutero-Isaiah, Cyrus is the great heroic figure, because the Persians develop a new policy. Instead of conquering and intermarrying, once they conquer, they allow the indigenous populations to live their lives and have their own culture. As long as they pay tribute to the Persian Empire, they can live. And so Cyrus is referred to in Deutero-Isaiah, the later parts of the book of Isaiah, as the Lord's Messiah. His anointed, Meshicho, is the way he's referred to. That's amazing. Cyrus is the messianic figure in the Bible. He might be a guy with maybe a little too much overreach in Herodotus. Well, what happens is, as you know, the Greeks defeat the Persians, but they picked up on their idea. And first Philip and then Alexander, they pick up on this idea of unifying Europe, Asia, and Africa. That's what the Persian Empire was trying to do. And now Alexander is going to imitate that, but instead of going west, he's going east. So he crosses the Aegean, he comes into Anatolia, he goes down to Egypt. Tradition tells us that he stops in at Jerusalem. And he heads all the way over to the Indus River, and his troops say, "We've had enough." And they start heading back, and he gets sick and he dies. The kingdom is split up into 4 kingdoms. This is what's known as the Hellenistic period. It's during the Hellenistic period that you have the rise of the Maccabees, right? Judas Maccabee. And they overthrow the Greeks, just as the Greeks valiantly overthrew the Persians. The Maccabees overthrow the Greeks and reestablish the kingdom of ancient Israel. This kingdom is as expansive as the kingdom of Israel ever was under the Maccabees. And it remains intact. Okay, it has its ups and downs. It has its internal political squabbling, but it remains intact all the way until the Romans, until the general Pompey comes in 63 BC and conquers the region of the Levant, right? This region from what is today Lebanon down to Egypt. And now the Romans have established their hold on this region. And what do they call it? They call it Palestina. Oh, why do they call it Palestina? because the Romans remember somehow in the tradition that there was a group of people that settled along the coast, the southern coast of Israel, down around where the Gaza Strip is today. Oh, and that group of people were known as Philistines. Oh, here's what you do. Just take the word Philistine and give it a Latin spelling, and you're going to get Palestine. Just like the Punic Wars that the Roman Republic has with Carthage, those wars, Punic, take the Latin word Punic and make it a Semitic word, and what do you get? Phoenicia, right? So the word Palestine has its origin in Roman times. It was referred to as a geographical region of the Levant, the eastern extent, shall we say, of the Roman Republic and eventually the Roman Empire. That's the full extent. That's the extent of this course this quarter.
Well, so we have a lot of wonderful questions in the chat. I'm going to try to group them where possible. And as it turns out, Rob and Jennifer and Bob are all asking for a similar type of question, which is, what is on your reading list? And how do you approach covering this much content over the course of 10 weeks? And addendum, are you willing to share your syllabus potentially as a follow-up with this group?
So short answer, yes, I will share my syllabus, and I will make that public in whatever way we want to do that, Seth. And then another short answer, I've got the main book that we're going to use right here. It's called the Carta Bible Atlas. This book was put together by two Israeli scholars, the best scholars in the field. One is Yochanan Aharoni, and the other one is Michael Aviona. It was revised and updated by Anson Rainey, one of my teachers, by the way, when I was in Israel. The maps are not the best in terms of 3-dimension, but the text and the maps together in this book are uncomparable. These two scholars have been able to take their cumulative knowledge and put it in layman's terms so that we can understand it. And the focus remains on the land. So it's really important for us to remember that this course is about the Holy Land. It's not so much about the Bible. Now, what happens is the three main religions come from the Bible, and that becomes really important. But what our focus is going to be is on the land. Now, in addition to that, each of them, Aharoni and Aviona, each of them has a full book that they've written. So here is Aharoni's book, and here is Aviona's book. One book is called The Land of the Bible, A Historical Geography. The other book is called The Holy Land, A Historical Geography. So what Aharoni does, he takes us from prehistory to the Persian Empire. What Aviona does, he takes us from the Persian Empire to the Arab conquest. And so we'll use this book primarily in the first quarter. We'll use a little bit of this book, but then this book continues in the second quarter. So now we've got these three books that are going to be the primary reading. And what we'll do then is we'll use the Bible selectively. So this is different than, shall we say, a basic program course where literature is the main focus. Here, the main focus is going to be the land. Maps are going to be very important for us, and then the explanation of those maps, and then the biblical stories to illustrate it, along with reading the Maccabees, and along with reading other literature from what is known as Second Temple period literature. We'll read selections from them. Okay, I hope that answers that question.
It does, although it begets another here from Bob Wegner, who says, will the class be taught by the same Socratic method as the basic program? So we realize not the same kind of literature or text only focus, but in terms of the method and your format to the class.
Yes, yes. So I would say that it's going to, the balance is going to change a little bit. in that it's probably going to be more 60-40. That is 60 where I'm going to be talking and I'm going to be helping you to understand what you are reading. Because, reading the Atlas is one thing. Reading Aharoni is another. This is a work of scholarship. And so most of it you're going to be able to understand because you're all intelligent people. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Most of it you're going to understand, but you're going to have questions about that. And so we'll engage in dialogue about it. We'll engage in dialogue about the stories and the maps that we see here. Once again, keeping in mind that the focus is going to be on the land. The focus is not going to be on the literary interpretation of the Bible or the theological meaning and significance of the Bible. All of that is there, but here's what I'm promising you. The more you take the time to learn about the land, the more you're going to be able to understand the literature of the Bible.
So we have another question from Greg Gosek, who asks, are there any living lineal descendants of the nations, in quotes, such as the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, inhabiting the Holy Land at the arrival of the Jews from Egypt, who were displaced with the creation of Israel?
Yeah, that's a really important question. There are many people who are asking that question. The only study that I know of that's done any kind of research on that is that there were studies done on the DNA of people living in a northern pocket of Lebanon. And what they found is that the DNA of people living there now matches the DNA of some of the bodies that have been exhumed from tombs from distant antiquity, so that there's a DNA match there. Apart from that, I'm not aware of studies. Various people are going to make claims. Yes, our ancestors have been here since the time of Jesus. Yes, our ancestors have been here since the time of David. But there's really no scientific study that validates that.
We have another question about why you called it prehistory if it is documented in the various sources that you reference. And so this is coming back to the beginning of your talk. And I think you may have been referencing sources that were referring backward, but you can answer that better than I can. That's right.
Yeah, that's right. So prehistory relies on material remains, and it relies on the interpretation of those material remains. Material remains are carefully cataloged and correlated. And so when you have, shall we say, material remains from one site, let's say you find some tools, and the style of those tools match tools that are found in Anatolia. And then you can begin to trace minor changes in those tools that begin to develop their own distinct styles. So prehistory depends very much on material culture and the interpretation of that material culture, and therefore the consensus of the scientific community of the interpretation of that material culture.
So we have another question here about what your future courses are going to look at. If this brings you to the Roman Empire, just tell us a bit about the next two and why you divided them into that kind of three-part trilogy.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So this course takes us up to the Romans coming to the Promised Land. The second quarter is going to take us from the Romans being there all the way up until the Ottoman Empire. And what happens during that time is the growth, the origin and development of Christianity, the destruction of the Second Temple, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman oppression of the Jews, which exclude them from coming within 5 miles of Jerusalem, which leads to, shall we say, a transformation of culture from Judah up to the Galilee, and then eventually to the rise of Islam in, let's just round it off around 600, and the conquest of this region by Muslims. And then that takes us up into the Crusader period, where the Christian kingdoms are trying to retake the Holy Land. Oh, and by the way, what I overlooked, what I skipped was the Byzantine period. Oh my gosh, and around whatever, 323, somewhere around there, Emperor Constantine has a vision. He has a vision of Christ and that he's going to be victorious. And he goes out and he wins and he dedicates himself. Oh, and what does he do? He commissions his wife and his mother to go to the Holy Land and find the places where Jesus lived, to find the place where Jesus was born, where Jesus was raised, where Jesus lived and walked, and where he was buried. And that gives us, shall we say, the origins of Christian pilgrimage and the high interest of Christianity through the Middle Ages. And of course, then that brings us into conflict with Islam. And, the story of Muhammad, who has his night journey to Al-Quds. Al-Quds, you spell that Quds. For those of you that know Hebrew, you know that's the Hebrew word for Kodesh. Al-Quds is the holy. It's the holy city. So Muhammad has this night journey to Jerusalem as if to say, this belongs to Islam. And so the second quarter takes us from the destruction of the Second Temple, the rise of Christianity, all the way through to the rise of Islam and up to the Ottoman Empire. And then the third quarter takes us from the Ottoman Empire up through colonialization and up through nationalism and independence and to the modern state of Israel in 1948, which brings us then up to the modern time. But think about this. You're getting there. You're getting there. You're getting to the modern times after having learned as much as anyone can about the land, the Holy Land, about Jerusalem, and about the surrounding region. There is no better way to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Jerusalem question than to have this full history behind you.
Well, we are at time, but you have left us at a thrilling point because you have brought us from prehistory, 5,000, 6,000 years ago to today, and you've helped us to see how the study that you're endeavoring to really look at the land over time as it stays, even as the people on it change, how that can not only give us an understanding of history, it can help us to better understand today, and it might even give us insight on what the future should look like. And in the UChicago spirit of open exchange, I'm sure that when you get there, you will have a lot of different perspectives in your classroom, which is what we thrive on here at the Graham School. So thank you to everyone for joining us. We will follow up, if it's okay, Stephen, with your syllabus so that people can see into the learning journey fully. And thank you for being an instructor at Graham. As everyone here can see, we are incredibly fortunate for your leadership at our school and for your imagination in this course sequence.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all for your interest. Great. Thank you, Seth. Very good.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Good.